She has never once done anything in her life worth being proud of. Not one thing. My mother's voice didn't waver. She said it the way she said everything, smoothly, with a faint smile, like she was commenting on the weather. But we weren't talking about the weather. We were standing in the reception hall of the Rideau Club in Ottawa, 90 people in formal dress, crystal glasses catching the light, and she'd just said that sentence about me loud enough for the table nearest the door to hear every word. She turned to the man beside her, Dr. Philip Drummond, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at the Ottawa Heart Institute, 42 years old, the youngest department head in the hospital's history, and the husband of my younger sister. She rested her hand on his forearm like he was a trophy she'd been saving for the right moment. "Now, Philip," she said, raising her voice just slightly so the sound carried, "is the kind of man I always hoped would be part of this family. A real contribution to this world, not someone who spent the last decade playing around with paint." My brother-in-law's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. They shifted from my mother's face, tracked slowly across the room, and landed on the small white tag clipped to my lapel, the one I'd forgotten I was even wearing. His expression didn't change gradually. It stopped, like a film reel snapping mid-frame. "Wait," he said, quiet enough that only our small corner of the room heard it. Then, louder, in the particular tone of someone recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a situation. "Tess, are you the one they call the cartographer?" My sister's champagne glass paused halfway to her mouth. My mother's smile held for exactly 2 more seconds before something behind it flickered out. But before I tell you what happened next, what that question cost my mother in front of everyone she'd spent 30 years performing for, I need you to understand what it took to get to that room and why I almost didn't go at all. The dinner was my sister's idea. Fiona had married Philip 8 months earlier, in a small ceremony in Gatineau that I'd flown back from Vancouver to attend. She was 31, radiant, and genuinely happy in a way that made me glad for her, even when the rest of that weekend felt like walking through broken glass in bare feet. Our mother had organized every detail of the reception, right down to the seating arrangements that placed me at the table nearest the kitchen, beside my mother's university friend and her teenage son who spent the whole night on his phone. This dinner was supposed to be different. "A private celebration," Fiona said on the phone. "Just close family and a few of Philip's colleagues. It'll be small, Tess." Relaxed. She's been better lately. I'd heard that before. I'd been hearing it since I was 19 years old and left for art school in Halifax, and our mother told my grandmother that I'd gone to waste 4 years doodling in the Maritimes. But Fiona was my sister, and when she asked me to come, I came. I landed at the Macdonald-Cartier Airport on a Thursday afternoon, February -14, the kind of cold that reminds you the city doesn't care whether you've had a good year or a bad one. I took a cab to the hotel instead of accepting my mother's offer to stay in the guest room, which was what I always did when I came home now, and which she always described to her friends as me preferring to keep my distance. What she didn't mention was the last time I'd stayed in that house. 3 years ago, after my father's second bypass surgery, I'd arrived exhausted from a 12-hour flight from a residency in Berlin, walked into the kitchen, set my bag down, and my mother had looked at me and said, "You could have at least had your hair done before you came." He has visitors. I booked the hotel room, every time. I need to go back further than that, though, because the Veterans Hall story, the one that becomes the dinner story, doesn't make sense without the house. Our father was a civil engineer, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who made lists and kept them. He built bridges, literally. Provincial infrastructure contracts, Northern Ontario, roads through Shield country, where the rock pushed back against everything you tried to do with it. He worked long stretches away and came home tired and gentle and smelling faintly of camp coffee and diesel. When he was home, the house had a different atmosphere. Lighter, like a pressure valve had been opened somewhere in the walls. My mother filled the silence when he wasn't there. She had a particular talent for it, filling silence with observations that landed just below the threshold of what anyone would openly call cruel. She never screamed. Screaming was unrefined. She had a voice like a letter opener, thin and precise, and she knew exactly where to slide it. I was 9 when I won a regional illustration contest through my school. 12 student drawings submitted. Mine was selected for the Provincial Youth Arts Calendar, April, a red-tailed hawk I'd spent 3 weeks on, every feather mapped in pencil before I added color. My teacher called the house to tell my mother personally. I stood in the hallway listening. My mother said, "That's sweet. I hope it doesn't make her think that's a realistic path." She hung up, walked past me without stopping. That was the whole conversation. I went back to my room and drew 17 more birds that night. Not out of spite. I didn't have the language for spite yet. Out of something more like determination that didn't have a name yet either. I filled the margins of my notebooks. I used the backs of her grocery lists when I ran out of paper. I drew on the paper bags from the SAQ until she found them and threw the whole pile out and told me I was being wasteful. The second lesson came the year I was 12. I'd been accepted into a Saturday enrichment program through the Ottawa School of Art. 8 weeks, actual instruction, proper materials, a real studio space on Daly Avenue with north-facing light. My father had signed the permission form before he left for a site in Sudbury. My mother unenrolled me the following Tuesday. "You have responsibilities here on Saturdays," she said, which meant helping her prepare for the dinners she hosted. The ones for her church committee, her neighborhood association, her garden club. Hours of setting tables and folding napkins into shapes from a book and carrying trays back and forth from the kitchen while her friends sat in the living room and praised her tablecloths. I became very good at making myself invisible in that house. It was the only skill it consistently rewarded. My father knew. I think he always knew, but for a long time he didn't know what to do about it. Or maybe he didn't have enough energy left after the job and the cold and the years of keeping things running to fight a battle on a second front. He showed his support in the language available to him. He kept my drawings. I discovered this years later when I was home for a weekend in my mid-20s and found a folder in the drawer of his workshop desk. 30 years of things I'd made, elementary school sketches, high school paintings, a photocopy of the April Hawk, even some figure studies I'd thought I'd thrown away. He'd found them in the recycling and kept them. He never mentioned it. That was the thing about my father. He kept a record of you. He just kept it quietly. When I was 17 and told him I wanted to apply to NSCAD, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, he didn't flinch. He sat at the kitchen table with the course calendar I'd sent away for and read through the whole thing with his reading glasses on and his coffee going cold beside him and said, "This looks like a serious program." That was his highest form of praise. My mother's response came 3 days later. She didn't find the calendar. I'd been careful with it. But she found the scholarship application I'd printed at the library and left in my bag. She set it on the counter between us, smoothed it flat with one hand, and said, "I'm going to ask you one time to think carefully about what you're doing to this family's expectations." When I didn't answer, she picked it up and fed it through the shredder in the home office, slow, looking at me the whole time. That night, my father came to find me in my room. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. He sat on the edge of my desk chair, which groaned under him because he was a big man, and he looked at the drawings pinned to my corkboard for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Mail it from school tomorrow. I'll pay the application fee." He slid $40 across the desk in a folded envelope. He stood up, squeezed my shoulder once, and left. That $40 was the most expensive thing he ever bought her silence with, and he never told her he'd done it. I got in. NSCAD changed me in every way I needed to be changed. 4 years in Halifax, then a year of contract work in Toronto, then a residency through the Canada Council in Berlin, another in Mexico City. I built a practice slowly, the way you build anything real, through work that nobody pays attention to at first, through the accumulated weight of trying and failing and trying differently. I specialized in large-scale architectural illustration and cartographic art. Technically, it's a niche that doesn't have a clean single name, which is why most people outside the field look at me blankly when I try to explain it. I work with urban planners, landscape architects, heritage organizations. I create visual documentation of places, the relationship between built structures and land, the way a city reads from above, the geography underneath the infrastructure. 7 years ago, the National Capital Commission commissioned me for a large-scale project, a series of 12 illustrative maps of Ottawa's evolution from the 19th century to present day, each one hand-rendered in watercolor and ink at 4 feet by 6 feet. The project took 2 years. It was the most demanding thing I'd ever done, and when it was finished, it toured 3 museums and was acquired by the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau. The commission's project director gave me a nickname during the second year, when I'd taken to spreading the reference materials across the entire floor of the studio to get the proportional relationships right. "You're like a cartographer who draws from memory," he said. "You just know where everything goes." The nickname circulated. Other planners, architects, heritage consultants. In the specific small world of Canadian architectural illustration, it had a particular meaning, a particular weight. My mother, who lived 40 minutes from the Canadian Museum of History, where my work hung in the permanent collection, had never visited the exhibition. I almost didn't wear the lanyard to the dinner. I'd come directly from a consultation at the NCC offices on Slater Street, running 20 minutes behind, still in my professional clothes, dark blazer, dress trousers, the white identification tag from the security desk still clipped to my lapel. I stood outside the Rideau Club in the February dark, looking at my reflection in the brass door plate, and I thought about taking it off. I thought, she'll say something about it. She'll make it into something. I left it on because I was already late and I didn't have anywhere to put it. The room was beautiful in the particular way that old Ottawa money makes things beautiful. Heavy drapes, real silver on the tables, a ceiling that reminded you the building had been there long before you were born and would be there long after. I found my seat, 3 chairs down from the head of the table, and settled in. My mother arrived 8 minutes later with Philip on one arm and Fiona on the other, working the room the way she always worked rooms, pausing at every chair, a name, a touch on the shoulder. The performance of warmth so practiced it was genuinely indistinguishable from the real thing unless you'd spent your childhood watching it get applied and removed like a coat. She reached my chair last. "You came," she said, not unkindly. Just with the slight register of surprise she always used when I showed up to things, as though my presence was a minor administrative inconvenience. She was graciously accommodating. The dinner moved the way formal dinners move. Courses arrived. Conversations overlapped. Philip's colleagues were interesting. A transplant coordinator from the General, a health policy researcher from Carleton, a cardiologist from Montreal who'd done her residency in Toronto and had opinions about the 401 that I completely agreed with. I was talking to the health policy researcher. Her name was Dr. Adeze Okonkwo, and she was one of the sharpest people I'd sat next to in years. When my mother's voice rose from the other end of the table with the specific carrying quality she deployed when she wanted to be overheard without appearing to project. She has never once done anything in her life worth being proud of. Not one thing. I felt the sentence before I parsed it. Like the half-second between touching a hot element and registering the burn, the health policy researcher went quiet beside me. My mother was gesturing in my direction, her expression gentle, confiding, the expression she used when she was saying something she wanted her audience to hear as reluctant honesty rather than cruelty. "It's a difficult thing," she said, "when you raise a child and they simply don't find a path. Philip," she turned to him, that hand on his forearm, "is the kind of man I always hoped would be part of this family, a real contribution to this world. Not someone who spent the last decade playing around with paint." I watched my brother-in-law's face in the moment she said it. Philip Drummond was a calm man. He'd done a decade of surgical training, which irons certain things out of you, the flinch response, the need to perform reaction. He didn't raise his eyebrows. He didn't look at me with the cautious sympathy I'd seen in the faces of everyone at every family dinner for the past 20 years. His eyes went to the lanyard on my lapel. He leaned forward slightly, and then something very precise happened in his expression, the look of a man whose internal database has just returned a match he wasn't expecting. Wait. A pause. "Tess, are you the one they call the cartographer?" The health policy researcher inhaled sharply beside me. My mother let out a short, bright laugh. "The what? Philip, don't encourage her. It's the NCC commission," he said. Not to my mother. To me, the 12 maps. They're in the permanent collection at the History Museum. I took my department for a team day there last spring. We spent an hour just with your work. He sat back slightly. "You did those." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. The table had gone quiet in the specific radius around our end of it. "My department head used them in a conference presentation in Geneva," Dr. Okonkwo said from beside me. Her voice was composed, but there was something underneath it, the particular quality of a person recalibrating, about sustainable urban development and historic land use. He sourced them for 15 minutes of slides. I didn't connect the name. My mother's laugh had not quite finished leaving the room. She tried again. "It's just illustrations. Maps aren't exactly. It's a very niche thing. Philip, you don't have to." "Mom," that was Fiona. Quiet. I'd never heard my sister use that tone with her before. "Stop, one word." Fiona had never once in 34 years of life told my mother to stop anything. The table heard it. My mother's mouth closed. Philip set his wine glass down. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the lanyard on my lapel, and then at me, and something in his expression made me think of the men in the Ottawa Valley who'd known my father. That particular form of male respect that is specific and technical and doesn't traffic in sentiment. "I showed those maps to my surgical residents," he said, "as an example of what it means to hold an entire system in your head at once, to understand how things connect, to see what's underneath the surface." He paused. "I didn't know you were her sister." "She never mentioned it," I said. He nodded slowly. "No. I imagine not." My mother left the table once to use the restroom and didn't come back for 11 minutes. When she returned, the conversation had redistributed itself. Dr. Okonkwo was asking me about the Mexico City residency. The transplant coordinator from the General had pulled out his phone and was showing the couple beside him something. I caught a glimpse of my own work on his screen. A man my mother had introduced at the start of the evening as a very old friend of the family, a retired Superior Court judge, had moved 2 seats closer and was asking me something about heritage preservation and the Rideau Canal corridor. My mother sat. She reached for her wine glass. Her eyes moved around the table in the practiced way she assessed rooms, calculating, reorienting. The room was not facing her. I watched her understand it. I watched the moment she realized that the evidence she'd assembled to make her case, her brilliant surgeon son-in-law, his accomplished colleagues, this beautiful room, had not performed according to the script. that the man she'd installed in the seat of honor had used his authority to say the precise opposite of what she'd intended. She didn't make another remark about me for the rest of the evening. After dessert, when the table had broken into smaller conversations, Philip came and sat beside me. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I had no idea what she was like. Fiona doesn't it. I think she's been doing it her whole life and doesn't even realize she's doing it." "She loves her," I said. "I know." He paused. "That's not the same as it being okay." He was right. It wasn't the same. It had taken me a long time to understand that those two things could both be true. That my sister loved my mother, and that my mother had done real damage to both of us, and that Fiona's way of surviving it had been to minimize the evidence, and that my way had been to leave and build something she couldn't get her hands on. Neither of us was wrong. We were just working with different tools. My mother was waiting in the lobby when I came down from the coat check. She wasn't wearing her public expression. That was the first thing I noticed. The one she wore in rooms was gone, the smooth social architecture of it, the precise warm smile. She looked smaller without it. Not old, exactly, just more accurately sized. She said, "I didn't know about the museum." I said nothing. Fiona should have told me. I put on my coat. The lobby was marble and wood, and our voices moved through it with more clarity than either of us intended. "The commission was in every national paper," I said. "The CBC did a feature. There was a review in the Globe." She looked at the floor. I didn't read them. I believed her. That was the thing. She hadn't avoided them deliberately, the way she'd turned her back at the funeral home, the way she'd unenrolled me from the art program, the way she'd shredded the application. She simply hadn't read them because she'd long ago decided there was nothing in that direction worth reading. My accomplishments existed in a file she'd marked closed before they'd happened. "I always expected you'd eventually settle," she said. The word sat in the air between us like something left out too long. "Get a proper position somewhere, something with a salary and benefits." I thought the art was just a phase, yes. I buttoned my coat. Outside, through the glass doors, February was doing what February does in Ottawa, not dramatically, just steadily, with the calm indifference of a season that has never needed to justify itself to anyone. "It's been 30 years, I said. "It was never a phase." She opened her mouth and then closed it. I watched her, this woman who had dismantled and reassembled herself for every room I'd ever seen her walk into, standing without a room to perform for, without an audience to calibrate, just the lobby and the marble and the sound of her own breathing. "I don't know how to." She stopped. "I didn't see it. What you were building. That wasn't an apology." I was old enough to know that people like my mother don't issue apologies. They acknowledge the arithmetic error while leaving the human cost off the balance sheet. She was telling me she'd miscalculated. She was not telling me that 30 years of miscalculation had left marks. I looked at her for a moment, not with anger. The anger had burned itself down years ago, somewhere in a studio in Berlin, somewhere on a street in Mexico City, somewhere in the accumulated weight of doing the work and letting the work be the answer to everything she'd said the work would never be. "I know you didn't," I said. I walked to the door. She didn't follow. There's a bench on Majors Hill Park that faces the river. My father used to take me there when I was small. Sunday mornings when my mother was at church and the city was quiet and the Gatineau Hills across the Ottawa River were doing what they do in every season. Just sitting there, vast and unhurried, not requiring anything from you. He would bring a thermos of tea, and we would sit, and he would point out the way the light fell differently on the Quebec side versus the Ottawa side, and how, if you looked long enough at the same view, you started to see things you'd missed. He said it was like engineering. You had to look at the same problem from enough angles before the solution became obvious. He died 4 years ago. Cardiac event, second one, in the night. He'd retired by then, was living in the house in Canada he'd bought when Fiona and I were in school. He died the way he'd lived, quietly, without making a fuss, leaving things in good order. I couldn't get to Ottawa in time for the last hours. I got the call on a Tuesday morning and was on a flight by Tuesday noon and arrived at the hospital on Tuesday night and he was already gone. My mother was in the family waiting room with my sister, and when I walked in, my mother stood and looked at me and said, "You should have come sooner." I said nothing. I sat down beside my sister and took her hand. The funeral was in Canada at the church they'd attended for 30 years. My mother ran it the way she ran all things. Precisely, with full control of every variable. She chose the readings. She chose the music. She chose the order of the reception line, and she positioned herself at the front of it, which was her right, and she positioned me toward the back, which was her management. His old colleagues came. Men from the engineering world, from the provincial government, from the companies he'd contracted with over 4 decades. They shook my mother's hand. They said the right things. When they drifted toward me, and they drifted the way water finds its level, because somehow they knew, my mother found reasons to redirect them. A word, a gesture, a hand on a sleeve. My aunt did the same on the other side. 15 years of attendance at his professional association dinners, and not one of those men was permitted to stand next to me for more than 30 seconds. I stood at the casket for a long time after the service ended, long enough that the funeral home staff began quietly gathering cups. He would have told me to take notes. He would have said, look long enough at the same problem, from enough angles, and eventually the solution becomes obvious. The solution had been obvious for years. I'd just been slow to act on it. I went back to Ottawa the following spring, when the ground had softened enough for the headstone to be properly set. I drove out to the cemetery in Nepean on a Saturday morning, coffee in a travel mug, the city still quiet in the way April mornings are before the gardening crowd arrives. His marker was simple. His name, his dates, a single line I'd asked Fiona to request from the engraver. It had taken some negotiation, because my mother had ideas about what the stone should say, but Fiona had stood firm. The line I chose was from a letter he'd sent me during my second year at NSCAD, one of the only letters he ever wrote that wasn't a card. He'd written, I have always been glad you were stubborn. Stubbornness, in the right direction, is just another word for engineering. That line is on his stone now. I crouched by the marker and pressed my hand flat against the granite. Cold the way granite always is, even on warm days, holding the temperature of something deeper than the surface. The maps are in the museum, Dad, I said. The ones you would have asked 11 questions about and then looked at for an hour without saying anything. The park was quiet around me. Somewhere behind me, a chickadee was having a conversation with itself in the branches. She said she didn't know. I believe her. I think that's the saddest version of it, that it wasn't strategy. She just never looked. I stayed there for a while, long enough for the coffee to go cold. When I stood to leave, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. The printed copy of the program from the museum's opening exhibition, the one where my 12 maps had been installed for the first time, floor to ceiling in the main gallery. My father's name was in it, in the acknowledgements, because I'd put it there. In memory of Douglas Beringer, who taught me to look long enough at the same thing. I tucked it under the base of the stone, against the granite, weighted it with a small piece of the river rock I'd brought in my pocket. It would dissolve in the next rain. That was fine. It wasn't for permanence. It was just for the morning. I straightened up, squared my shoulders the way he'd always done when he was about to walk into something hard. I'm all right, I said. I don't need her to see it anymore. The work is there. The work says everything. I drove back into the city on the 417, the Gatineau Hills visible in the rearview mirror, getting smaller and then disappearing as the road curved south. I didn't look back at them. I just drove forward into the ordinary Saturday morning, into the work still waiting, into the life I'd built from the $40 in an envelope and 30 years of not stopping. That was enough. That had always been enough. If you've ever built something real and quietly, something that didn't ask permission, that existed on its own terms, and you've ever stood in a room where the people who doubted you didn't know they were standing next to the evidence, you know what that silence felt like. It doesn't need to be said out loud. The work already said it. It said it long before you walked into the room.